Good evening and welcome to our public lecture series at the National Humanities Center. I'm Robert Newman, the president of the center. I wanted to remind you to put on your calendars a couple of forthcoming public lectures. On March 21st, best-selling novelist and North Carolina native Lee Smith will be here reading from her autobiography, Dime Store. On April the 12th, Tara Hunter, professor at Princeton, and Andrea Williams, a professor at Ohio State, both of whom are fellows this year, will be having a conversation about African American marriage in the 20th century. That's April the 12th. So please put that on your calendars. In a September 1997 New York Times review of Image and Logic, Peter Galison's 955-page exploration of the research practices of particle physicists was described, and the reviewer described Peter as a wunderkind who had burst on the scene after earning his PhD from Harvard in both physics and the history of science. Around the same time that this review appeared, Peter received the prestigious John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Fellowship, commonly referred to as the Genius Grant. And in the 20 years since, he has repeatedly demonstrated that those early appraisals were more than justified. His work has been recognized with the Pfizer Award from the History of Science Society and the Max Planck Award from the Max Planck Gesellschaft and Humboldt Stiftung. Peter's main work explores the complex interaction between the subcultures of 20th century physics, experimentation, instrumentation, and theory, and his monographs, How Experiments End, published in 1987, Image and Logic, published in 1997, and Einstein's Clocks, Poincaré's Maps in 2003, have made significant contributions to our understanding of how the realm of physics has been shaped through its variety of practices, the tools it employs, and the way it is conceived by theorists. In addition to these works, Peter has collaborated with a variety of other scholars to produce a series of books exploring cross-currents between science and other domains of knowledge, including Big Science with Bruce Hevely, The Disunity of Science with David Stump, The Architecture of Science with Emily Thompson, Scientific Authorship with Mario Biagioli, Einstein for the 21st Century with Gerald Holton and Sylvan Schweber, Atmospheric Flight in the 20th Century with Alex Roland, and Picturing Science, Producing Art with Caroline Jones. If this were not enough, Peter also has become a prolific filmmaker, producing 3 documentary features. His first film, The Ultimate Weapon, which he wrote and produced for the History Channel, recounted the scientific and political decisions surrounding the development of the hydrogen bomb. His successive films, both produced and directed with Rob Moss, include Secrecy, examining the costs and benefits of government secrets, and Containment, which considers how countries around the world are dealing with the hundreds of millions of gallons of radioactive sludge produced since World War II. Since 1993, Peter has served on the faculty at Harvard, where he is currently the Pellegrino University Professor in History of Science and Physics, and where he also serves as director of the Collection of Historical Scientific Instruments. This spring, as the Rockefeller Fellow here at the center, he is once again collaborating with MIT art historian Caroline Jones on a new project examining the ways scientific images shape the ways we understand and engage images like climate change and environmental degradation. Please join me in welcoming Peter Galison as he talks with us about Wastelands and Wilderness, Nuclear Lands. Peter.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you all for being here. It's an honor and a great pleasure to spend this semester here with many of you and to have a chance to speak with you, to hear about your projects, and to explore new ideas. Today, I'd like to speak about wastelands and wilderness, two domains that at first sight might appear to be the exact opposite, occupy opposite ends on a kind of spectrum, if you like, from ultraviolet to infrared, from the farthest up to the farthest down. And this is how the narration of these categories has been made over many years. We think of wilderness as that pure and primordial set of land, the untouched, the innocent, the Edenic, and wastelands as their exact opposite, that which is destroyed, defiled, and represents the worst possible fate of land. What I want to do today is to talk a little bit about a new kind of topology of the imaginary land that we are in and the reality of that land in a regulatory and experiential sense. That wastelands and wilderness come to occupy some of the same categories, the same way we occupy them, that our relationship to them comes in regulatory, philosophical, and practical ways to join in ways that I want to talk about today. The film that Robert mentioned that I made with Rob Moss, my colleague and friend at Harvard, had to do with this idea of containment and the idea or the hope, the aspiration that we might be able to isolate nuclear materials, or anything for that matter, for what amounts to an eternity. Let me just play the first few minutes of that to give you an idea of what I'm up to there. It opens near Fukushima in Japan after the triple meltdown.
Do not destroy these markers. These standing stones mark an area once used to bury radioactive wastes. These wastes give off invisible energy that can destroy plants, animals, and people. The rock and water in this area may not look, feel, or smell unusual, but may be poisoned. Do not dig here. Do not drill here. These markers were designed to last 10,000 years.
The problem of nuclear waste begins at the same moment as the nuclear age. Already at Los Alamos, in the midst of producing the nuclear weapons that were used in World War II, that first atomic war, the waste was considered to be in the way of progress and simply unceremoniously dumped into shallow ditches, put into rusting cans, and disposed of. With the Cold War, that same sense of urgency, protected by layers of secrecy, kept the nuclear waste out of the regulatory domain of the civilian government and regulatory agencies. And here, as at the Idaho National Laboratory, 55-gallon drums were simply dumped over the side of the road and then covered with a thin layer of sand. The civilian nuclear sector has produced a huge amount of waste, too, in a very different form, not sludge or barrels, but the rods that are used to make power. When they come out of a nuclear power plant, they're extremely hot. The whole point of nuclear fission is to make these rods hot enough to boil water and make steam and drive turbines that make the electricity that we use. When they're taken out of the reactor, they're still that hot, and they're put into these large, what amount to swimming pools, that contain these, using the water to protect the public from or the workers there from radiation, as well as cooling them by circulating that water. When the water stops circulating, as happened at Fukushima, it gets hotter and hotter until it begins to boil. It can boil off, and those rods left in the open air can begin to catch fire. If they catch fire, it's a catastrophe of unmitigated proportions. The Prime Minister of Japan was worried during the triple meltdown that they knew the rods were boiling the water off and were being partially exposed, and both the Americans and the Japanese began to suspect that they might catch fire. If they had, it might have required, as the Prime Minister Naoto Kan said, a full evacuation of Greater Tokyo, which is 50 million people. Nobody's ever evacuated anything like 50 million people. It would have been, as he said, the end of modern Japan. So the stakes of containment are high, and the length of contamination, the length of time that contamination can last from nuclear sources is vast. There's a kind of geography of waste, or a political geography, or a political economic geography of waste that tends to locate the waste in certain areas of the country and the world. This raises questions of environmental justice and who should bear the burden for this waste. Should it be, as some people say, located near where the people who benefited economically from the production of that waste live? The problem there is the place where the plants are actually located often doesn't benefit the people located right next to it. The people that benefit from it get electricity often hundreds, even thousands of miles away. And so the idea that somehow by keeping the waste on site, you're punishing the people who benefited from it is a somewhat problematic notion. But the political geography of waste has been a powerful issue. In countries all over the world, this is a map of the world distended by the amount of nuclear waste that's held by the country. There you can see Japan is large in purple, China is green, and so on. And this has, in each of these countries, raised huge problems. The government of Sweden fell several times over questions about the disposition of nuclear waste. In Germany, debates over where nuclear waste should be located was highly politicized and ferociously contentious. In the United States, when a plant was to be opened originally in the 1980s, called the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant, Congress, designating the Environmental Protection Agency as the enforcement authority, demanded that the EPA would regulate this waste for a period of 10,000 years. Now, the procedure for getting there was simply the application of a kind of bureaucratic rule following. The EPA would regulate an insecticide or a chemical by how long it's likely to remain toxic in the place where it was being disposed. So if that was 10 years or 15 years, that would be the regulatory period before it was degraded by moisture or diffusion or something else, or simply chemically degraded till no longer be toxic. The problem is that plutonium, one of the main features of the manufacture of nuclear weapons, has a half-life, that is the time under which it decays to half as radioactive as it was at the beginning of that time, is 24,000 years. So if you want to reduce the amount of radiation by, say, a factor of 1,000, you need something like 240,000 years. Well, the EPA said, we can't regulate for 240,000 years. We can't regulate even 24,000 years, but let's get to that order of magnitude, take twice recorded human history and set it at 10,000 years. Now, such legal scope is entirely unprecedented in the history of law, from the Roman corpus juris to the present. But that was what was demanded. In essence, the bureaucracy created science fiction. That got worse. The people that lived near the Yucca Mountain facility, it's part of the Nevada test site, the nuclear test site, where nuclear weapons were tested in the hundreds over many years. Many of them did not want this plant. Nevada did not want this plant to go up and to have all the civilian nuclear waste concentrated there. So they protested and they appealed to the National Academy of Sciences, and they said, how long is this waste going to remain toxic? In fact, when is it going to peak? So the National Academy of Sciences, the highest ranking scientific entity in the United States, said, well, between the plutonium and other related materials and the materials that they decay to, the peak is going to happen somewhere between 100,000 and 1 million years. So the court said, okay, so if that's when the peak radiation is going to be, we're going to require sequestering this waste for 1 million years. Now, the problem is, however hard it is to imagine 10,000 years in the future, 1 million years in the future is a horse of a different color. 1 million years ago, we weren't us. Homo sapiens, generously has had a run of 200,000 years. So 1 million years from now, the chances that we can even talk about our descendants, is pretty much zero. Now, if time is one factor that nuclear waste raises questions about scales of time that are hard, that are difficult, they're so out proportion to our normal political cycle of 2, 4, 6 years, let alone our obsession with fiscal quarters and fiscal years, that it seems that we've created something that's out of proportion from our abilities to imagine in time. But in space, too, that takes place. There is the decision about where to put waste and the dangers that it can create if it gets out, like the Chernobyl accident, which diffused over much of Europe, or the Japanese accident at Fukushima, which can be measured far around the Pacific Basin, creates these new kinds of problems. The Auschwitz II plant in Lower Saxony in Germany was put there by the Kohl government to be on the border with East Germany, as were other nuclear waste plants. And the East Germans certainly returned the favor, and probably even earlier. So the borders were used as a confrontation place. But that's not just in confrontational political situations. Spain has power plants on the border with Portugal, much to the Portuguese anger. And this happens over and over again. Borders somehow reduce by half the number of the interior population of a country that has to deal with it. The Auschwitz II plant, because it was located politically, was not well thought out geologically, and it leaks. There's water flowing into it, underground rivers. It's a catastrophe. It's in some ways the worst Western European site that there is. In shipping the waste from plants all around the country, if you don't want to leave them where they are, just to give you an example of the problems with leaving things where they are, is there's a plant near Minneapolis that's located literally a stone's throw from the tribal headquarters of an Indian nation there. And the Native Americans have benefited zero from that plant. They weren't hired at the plant. They don't even get electricity from the plant. They're not given collateral payments from the plant. They had dirt roads and no centralized facilities for water or wastewater until finally they got permission to open a casino and had enough money to hire a few lawyers. It would be one lawyer facing 36 lawyers from the plant, but at least they had some legal representation and they got their roads paved. But the alternative to that is centralizing the waste, as happens in the case of defense waste that's going to this plant at the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant in southeastern New Mexico. You can see it labeled there in the corner. And now New Mexico already has a huge political struggle between the southeast and the north. Most of the state lives in terms of number of population, in Albuquerque, which is a highly diverse and capital D Democratic voting part of the state. The Southeast is capital R Republican, and even though that people in the plant work for the federal government, they detest. I mean, when I was down there filming, there were signs, anti-Obama signs all over the lockers, and so there's a real political struggle. So you say, who gets to decide about this waste? Does the town of Carlsbad, which has 1,000 jobs being created there, $100,000 apiece, including benefits, or do the towns a little farther away get to decide? Does Albuquerque get to vote? Is it a state? What about the nearby states? The waste isolation pilot plant is a lot nearer Mexico than it is even to Albuquerque. But I never saw a single document or heard a single person even bring up the idea that maybe the Mexicans should have some vote on what happens next to their border. So the problems of the political geography of deciding about nuclear waste are in many ways as complex as the attempt to warn and safeguard the far future. The plant itself is located about a half-mile underground in a salt cavern. There was an ancient sea in this part of the country, a huge ancient sea, about 250 million years old, and the sea would get filled and dry out over and over again, creating a half-mile thick layer of salt. And so you could dig in that salt, emplace the waste, and then the salt would slowly flow under the forces, just the pressure of being that far underground, and encase or encist the barrels that were put there. This is what it looks like. For miners, it's actually not too bad a place to work. The ceilings are much higher than uranium mine or most of the kinds of mining that gets done, even other kinds of salt mines. So in order to make this nuclear waste site, the federal government used rules or regulations of land withdrawal. The federal government can remove land from public use or from other agencies and restrict what goes on there. It's used for military sites. It's used also to create wilderness areas. And the 16 square miles around this plant, 4 miles by 4 miles square, were withdrawn to be surrounded by a land withdrawal boundary that would have active measures and passive measures, archives, and markers. This is what was required. Active measures meant while the plant's operating, there are military vehicles with essentially a private army called the Walkenhuts who go around with machine guns, and you don't get on the land. But once the plant closes in a couple of decades, then no one's going to want to pay for this. Nobody thinks that the Walkenhuts are going to be there for 10,000 years. And we know from other closed nuclear plants that once things stop making money, either from the federal government or the private sector, no one wants to stay there. So the question is, what happens after that? The question is to identify what are the dangers, how do you mark it, can you get people to heed those markers in the far future for a period of 400 generations. So you want to predict the future. Who do you call? Well, in the United States, about a year before the end of World War II, the Air Force was worried about just this question. They saw a war that was going to involve nuclear weapons, ballistic missiles, and cruise missiles that the Germans had invented, the V1 and the V2, radar, counter radar. It was a science war for the first time. And so they set up a branch of the Air Force that was supposed to predict how they would fight World War III. And that eventually led to the Rand Corporation. And in the Rand Corporation, Herman Kahn, a kind of genius, but also the model for Dr. Strangelove, literally the model for Dr. Strangelove, began to develop something called scenario thinking, in which you would ask a kind of what-if question. What if a nuclear bomb goes off near the Frankfurt am Main Air Force Base? What happens? What if, all communication is lost to the submarine fleet? What if? And then he would borrow from history, borrow from myth, Armageddon, the final battle between good and evil, presaging the end of the world. Could you make a scenario out of that? Camlan, King Arthur's final battle with Mordred, a legendary inquiry into the accidental start of a major conflict. The European peace from 1871 to 1914, where the balance of power that everyone thought was stable suddenly could practically overnight fall to pieces. One of the people who joined this group, somewhat later, Ted Gordon, Theodore J. Gordon, was involved with building the Saturn V rocket, the huge rocket that was used for the moon launches. And then NASA had him predicting about space colonization, travel to other planets. So he was a senior engineer, he was a rocket scientist in the literal sense, and he began to think about these scenarios, not kind of full-on images of the future. This is not a novelistic or a movie like The Matrix. It's not a kind of detailed vision. It's just a kind of snapshot, a kind of strobe flash of the future in order to see what might happen. So he was among the people, these futurists that were called in, and he said, and the other futurists said, we're used to predicting 10 years, 20 years, 30 years into the future at the absolute maximum. They were looking in the 1960s at the year 2000. That was kind of the far future. And he said, are you kidding? You want me to predict 10,000 years from now? And the weapons laboratory said, yes, we have to do it. Congress required it. They gave it to the Environmental Protection Agency. The Environmental Protection Agency handed it off to the Sandia National Labs, which designs nose cones and other material for nuclear weapons. And they said, make us some futures. Tell us what the dangers are. Give us some glimpses of things that could go wrong 10,000 years from now, and then we can figure out how to mark those sites to keep that from happening. So they gathered anthropologists, archaeologists, astronomers, futurists, linguists, material scientists, physicists, semioticians. But the first question was, what kind of future dangers might there be? Well, they said, maybe there'd be a Houston to LA underground train. I mean, the way the futurists worked is they'd look at some current trend and then do a kind of asymptotic limit. So tunneling was getting much easier, much cheaper. Well, what if it became so cheap you could dig a tunnel from Houston to LA? That path, if you draw it on a map, goes right through the WIP site. What about climate change? That might suddenly, what was a desert might be desperately needed for water. What about if there were robotic mole miners that lost their instructions or that came to the site from underground where they wouldn't see the markers on the surface? What if people were returning from space? And you say, well, why would anybody land there? Well, it looks like an empty area, and in fact, it's been used for several test returns from space. What about treasure hunters? Look, I mean, we went to Tutankhamun's tomb. It said, don't dig here, or your children will die miserable deaths till the end of all time. And we said, or Schliemann said, or whoever it was said, let's dig here. They're probably hiding treasure. So suppose someone sees these signs and it says, don't dig here, radioactive waste. Forget it. They say, well, maybe they're just hiding their really good stuff, so let's dig. So among the people that they brought in to warn about the future were the people who had actually sent messages to really distant civilizations. Well, the SETI people did. Carl Sagan and his group designed the golden plaque for the side of the Voyager spacecrafts in 1979, and they brought them in. Maybe they could warn our future, if not a civilization many distant years from here. The archaeologists said, what's worked in the past? What do we know about the pyramids, the Indian mounds, the great monuments of Athens, Stonehenge? And they said, look, what really worked, we don't really know what the Indian mounds were about. We really don't know that much about Stonehenge. We have some guesses about its astronomical and ritual uses, but not much more. But the Acropolis, there we have a good idea because we have a combination of archaeological remnants and written materials. So let's build that way. So each of these glimpses of communication, whether to aliens, to the far future, the ex-Rand futurists, the archaeologists, semioticians, and others, tried to give them some notion of how to mark. One dispute was, do you use pictures or do you are people universal or are they particular? Do you have to pay attention to local culture or somehow something in common to all cultures? And that was a big dispute among the anthropologists and archaeologists. One group said, oh no, there's universal recognition of facial expressions of horror and disgust, of fear, and we can use that to design these monuments. Others said, no, let's just try to make a kind of Rosetta Stone, and the future will figure it out the way we figured out the Rosetta Stone. So they designed a series of levels, a kind of, this was built by humans, this is dangerous. This is dangerous because it includes radioactive waste, and here's everything we know about radiomedicine, cancer, and nuclear physics. And they would be sort of buried in sequential form. So one of them would say, danger, poisonous radioactive waste buried here. Do not dig or drill before AD 12,000. And then they got more. The surface monuments, as you saw in that animation at the beginning of the film, one of them was called Spike Field, that would suggest something dangerous, that spikes were somehow something people would respond to and move away from. Another was called Spikes Bursting Through Grid, a Cartesian grid which suggested that we, the civilization that had built this, had mastered rationality, and yet it was penetrated by these ferocious spikes of something bad from underneath. Another was called Menacing Earthworks, seen from different angles, or Black Hole, one of my particular favorites, that was supposed to gather so much heat by being black that nobody would want to walk on it. Of course, the architects were so enamored of the idea of setting scale by people that they have people walking on it, which undermines the idea, but be that as it may. Another was this one, a kind of pseudo-city, no doubt people looking at the great earthworks that were coming up in the 60s and 70s, like Michael Heitzer's, Smithson's Spiral Jetty. And here you would be able to walk among the stones, but never quite find your orientation. And there was never enough space to farm or to live. Now, one of the things that's been very interesting about this is that much of the work that was done about the WIP site has been grappled with for many years by the Japanese. The tsunami danger, long before Fukushima, but including after Fukushima, was these tsunamis. As you know, the population of Japan is almost entirely along the coast. The mountains that constitute the bulk of the main island are very tough to live in. And you can have there's some farming and some cattle ranching, but most people live on the coasts. So the tsunamis are a huge danger, and they've been that way for as long as people have been living there. So they would take these monuments, and for almost 1,000 years, they've been building monuments on the coast. Here's a little sequence about their attempt to warn their future, that is to say, us. We are the future. We are the distant millennial future of these times.
過去三陸沿岸部というのは地震また津波によって大きな被害を受けました。でこの被害を将来の皆さんにきちんと残したいということで石碑が建てられ、そこにメッセージが加えられています。でこれから読むのが姉吉での碑文です。高き住居は自尊の和楽、思い絵参加の大津波。ここより下に家を建てるな。特に現在の我々日本人というのはその石碑のメッセージの重要性とかそれが将来に来るということをあまり気にしないですね。これはただ単に昔のことであって将来我々に本当に起こると。
These monuments have been plowed under by roads, they've been stolen by people, they've been dismissed as archaic, and they suggest some of the dangers to any kind of monument. That is to say, the monument could be destroyed. Some of them have been destroyed by tsunamis. But also, you could read them, understand them, but somehow not think they're relevant. And that was another danger that the Americans faced in these marking campaigns. Now I want to switch gears. So these are radioactive wastelands, and I'm going to come back to them. In 1964, out of a long environmental movement, came the Wilderness Act. And a wilderness was defined this way. A wilderness, in contrast with those areas where man and his works dominate the landscape, is hereby recognized as an area where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man, where man himself is a visitor who does not remain. An area of wilderness is further defined to mean undeveloped federal land retaining its primeval character and influence, without permanent improvements, protected and managed so as to preserve its natural conditions. Now, what's happened is that these kind of conditions, the idea of humans as visitors, has now become part and parcel, even in law in Japan, in Chernobyl, in many of the sites in the United States, where you can visit but you can't stay, and where permanent structures must not be erected. In the Rocky Mountain Arsenal, they say, while the industrial core of the site was contaminated, deer, prairie dogs, coyotes, and species of hawks, owls, and birds have thrived in the abandoned fields, grasslands, and woodlots that had been protected from 40 years of urban sprawl and development. In Fukushima, there's been a return of wild boars throughout the region, now undisturbed by people living there. Or the famous wolves of Chernobyl. Now, there's a huge debate about, that there are instances of radioactive mutation, but not at the kind of thing that you would see in a horror movie, although that gets built into all sorts of video games and novels regularly. But still, in the absence of people, because people can only go there as visitors, this has changed the status and the biodiversity quotient of the land. A site that is about 10 to 15 times the size of Manhattan is the Savannah River site, the South Carolina nuclear weapons plant, where about a third of the plutonium that fueled the nuclear Cold War was manufactured. About 2/3 of it was made in Hanford in Washington State, and 1/3 in Savannah River. So these are immense areas that are highly contaminated. And Savannah River has more radioactivity in it than any other site in the United States. And so it has, again, become one of the most biodiverse sites, maybe the most biodiverse sites in the continental United States. Now, they allow hunting there for a couple of days a year, and the hunters have to be mindful of a few things, but one of them is they have to have any animals that they shoot not only pass inspection for weight and so on, but also checked for their radioactive content by passing them through sophisticated scanners. At Savannah River, there are signs that mark the presence of radioactive material underground. Many of them have been dumped unceremoniously inside the site. For instance, one of the warplanes that was victim, or two of them crashed over Spain, Palermo, Spain, and a couple of the hydrogen bombs dropped out of the sky. One of them exploded on land, not as a hydrogen bomb explosion, but as its normal explosions scattered the plutonium all over the place. Another one went out in sea and was recovered. But the Spanish said, now you're going to clean this up. So they scooped up huge amounts of land. They've done this many times. That sand and soil is dumped here at the Savannah River site. What you see over there is the attempt to archive the huge amount of material from the site. Here are graphics. The Savannah River site, because it had this radioactivity, because it was free of, on the whole, of human intervention, became this Savannah River ecological site and was the origin site for a lot of systems ecology, the kind of cybernetic inflected ecology that the Odom brothers helped create in the 1950s, and it continues as a major ecological laboratory. One of the advantages of being there was its biodiversity. Another was its isolation. A third was that you could trace the radioactive isotopes as they moved up the food chain and see exactly who was eating who or who was absorbing what. Here's a little clip from that lab.
This is where we kept the radioactive turtles when we were doing that study. And this is where we put them today if we've come across any. So this is this is a big female of this species. They're very friendly, as you can see. This is called a slider turtle, yellow-bellied slider turtle. And when they've been in a radioactive area, they will accumulate strontium in the shell and cesium in the muscle tissue, and at very high levels. There are radioactive alligators on the site. The radioactive materials are in the sediments. It's going to go up the food chain, and there's going to be radioactive alligators. The irony is radioactivity in an indirect way has been good for the wildlife because it keeps development, industry, agriculture off the site. Here they're protected, maybe for the wrong reason, but they are protected, and so we have some of the highest biodiversity on the Savannah River site that can be found in the eastern United States, or maybe even the whole United States.
It's not just there. There's Fermilab, there's Hanford, there's Idaho National Laboratory. Idaho National Laboratory, most of you may not have even heard of. It's 568,000 acres. These are immense areas of the country. Los Alamos, 28,000. The Nevada Test Range, 864,000. Savannah River Site, 200,000. So some of these sites are as big as Rhode Island. I mean, they are immense areas. And they have become a kind of de facto wilderness area, contaminated, protected from people, isolated except for short-term visits, without permanent structures, made roadless in many cases. They've recreated those categories that were, by regulation, established as a wilderness area in the 1960s. The White Sands Missile Range is an immense area. It's 60 miles wide and 100 miles long. And again, there are species endemic to these sites that are found nowhere else in the world. They become sites protected by toxicity. There was also the other kind of direction, that is to say, not wastelands to wilderness, but the wild to waste. This was a part of a systematic Atomic Energy Commission project to get a kind of what they called a baseline of what nature was like before humans in order to measure the effect of radioactivity on them. And then they would release radioactivity into those environments: Arctic tundra, deserts, rainforests. This is one in Puerto Rico at El Verde, where they exposed a part of the rainforest that had been otherwise untouched to cesium-137, one of the main fission products of power and weapons. And then you see what lives and what dies as a function of radius from the source, which is you're seeing in this picture. Now, another kind of nuclear wasteland is produced not by intentional use of the production of power or weapons, and not by burial of the waste, but by the dramatic accidents, of which there have been many, the two most famous, of course, being Chernobyl and Fukushima, but there was a huge accident at Windscale in Britain, and there have been accidents in many places in Russia, in East Germany, in what former East Germany, Canada, all over the place. And so looking at what happens to those lands is again a problem, now not of containment, but of a hopelessly more difficult task, as hard as containment might be, of recontainment. And that meant, in many cases, as you drive along the roads around the Fukushima prefecture, you see these garbage bags, which are essentially filled with topsoil. The problem is every time it rained, the stuff went deeper, and the idea of actually cleaning up, there are people with sticks and twigs at the end sweeping the dust off the roads or cleaning out a playground. And one playground that we filmed in had a giant Geiger counter, sort of from me to that speaker, and which flashed the moment-to-moment radioactive level in the playground. So it's living in the waste in that sense is immensely difficult, and it's of a different order to clean it up than anything you might have localized, as hard as that is. So how do you think about the future, worried about these different kinds of semiotic and archaeological, these schemes of making physical monuments or layers of monuments? Well, one thing that people thought was that maybe the monuments wouldn't work at all, and that you needed some other form. Now, Thomas Seebuck, who was at Department of Energy in Bechtel, began to talk about a nuclear priesthood. He said, what are we most able to communicate? Well, the Catholic Church has done pretty well, communicating from generation to generation, not trying to launch a kind of long pass into the future, but of making it more of a relay, where each generation would pass and train a cadre of people who would have this knowledge that could pass it on. He was roundly mocked by this, by many different communities, but the idea has survived in other forms, of the idea of trying to make a myth or a story that would be transmitted. The Japanese, for instance, one of the most successful forms of tsunami preparation has been children's books and stories that are told and repeated over and over again about the head of a town who he knew that a tsunami was coming. He saw the signal retreat of the tide, but he couldn't get anybody to hear him, much less understand what he was saying. So he lit the supply of rice on fire up high, and by convention, everybody would run up with water, and they were saved. So this story got repeated over and over again, and it's used all over the Pacific Basin now in children's books of different sorts to warn people. But it was also this idea of the connection between waste and wilderness has been taken up even religiously, not just by Thomas Seebuck's nuclear priesthood, but by the deep ecologists, one of whom wrote, taking care of nuclear and toxic wastes may mean sitting with toxic chemicals, sitting with attentiveness, not passively. This is a type of caring practiced by Buddhists in some of their forms of meditation. So we begin to see even a theological register in which the nuclear has its impact. Finally, there's a kind of nuclear tourism that's developed, a kind of branch of the broader category of what's called dark tourism in the Bikini Islands, where some of the locals have begun to organize diving trips. They said, you wanted to know always what diving was like in the old days? Well, here it is. In the Bikini Atoll, you can dive and see the fish and the coral that are there, and also dive the warships, Japanese and American, that were sunk by the testing and Operation Crossbow of nuclear weapons in the 1940s and 50s. So the kind of apocalyptic and primordial are sort of fused together, in which we begin to get, you're offered a chance to see the deep past, the way things used to be. At the same time, you saw the conserved vision, the conserved remnants of an actual nuclear detonation. The Trinity site, the first nuclear weapon detonated, the practice bomb for the one that was used on Nagasaki, is now also a tourist site, and people come. There are huge caravans of cars that are let in once a year. Here you see a young little blonde tourist coming to the site, but this is a wider phenomenon. There are nuclear tourism catalogs and companies that will bring you to Chernobyl, for instance, where you can photograph yourself in front of the meltdown site, the pools, the old schools. And again, there's this mix of an apocalyptic and a kind of historicizing triumphalism. Western Europeans love to go, and they're told to come, and you can see the remnants of Soviet architecture and this Soviet life that's now disappeared. Here are people trying on gas masks and other things that they're finding left over in one of the schools there from the accident. Now, the waste isolation pilot plant operated pretty smoothly between its opening at the end of the 1990s and Valentine's Day 2014. What happened was there had been a typo, and in one of the meetings, someone wrote down what we need kitty litter. So they needed kitty litter to absorb the liquid wastes, because you don't want to put liquids into salt. It's not a good idea. So they said, get some inorganic kitty litter. And the person typing wrote, an organic kitty litter. You may buy Sweet Scoop yourself for your favorite cat. But Sweet Scoop, the wheat-based organic kitty litter, mixed with the nitrates that were produced in these radioactive salts to make a patented explosive, and it mixed and eventually caught fire and created an accident, exposing about 20 workers to low levels of radiation and shutting down the plant, costing several $billion to reopen, which it's only beginning to do now, 4 years later. And what about memory? Well, you have disposal site museums that are beginning to open up, where to try to preserve memory, you have this legacy. At Chernobyl, that's sort of crossed with a kind of history, heroizing museum, and a kind of shrine/amusement zone with multiple lights that looks for all the world like a cross between a tomb, an entertainment area, and a disco. So when back in 1989, 1990, those scenarios included one scenario where they successfully communicated with the future because they disobeyed their operating instructions, their prime directive. They were supposed to imagine penetration inadvertent into the plant. And they disagreed. They said, we're going to have one that worked. And that was that they built a kind of memory museum and entertainment center, and that this somehow kept the plant from being entered. This is from graphic novel sequences in the film. Now, that might have seemed completely far-fetched. They had this character named Nicky Nuke based on Mickey Mouse, but Fukushima is already talking about a memory park and amusement park combined that would occupy the place, the amusement park to bring people in, the memory park to bear the memory of what had happened there. And perhaps one can't avoid the radiating aspect, so to speak, of this waste into contemporary politics. When the present president began to discuss a massive spending of $20 to $25 billion on the wall, one of the proposals was to make a nuclear waste site on the wall, or in the wall, in which power would be generated and the nuclear waste, doing Helmut Kohl and his team one better by making the nuclear waste actually part of the obstacle to transnational movement. So what we have in this back and forth crossing of the legal, the theological, the regulatory, practical means of containing nuclear waste, the attempts to recontain nuclear waste, the idea that we were only visitors, that we were changing our relationship to the land itself, that we became a kind of alienated nuclear tourists on these lands in a way that perhaps Aldo Leopold's ideas that were embodied in the 1964 Wilderness Act could only dream of, where people would really be staying out of permanent occupation of these wilderness areas as much by fear as by a protective impulse. And so as we make these spiked areas of nuclear waste, as we think about trying to guard these lands for the long future, we may just have put a crown of thorns on the earth to which we no longer belong, except as nuclear tourists. Thank you.
What do you think is the best of the bad solutions to nuclear waste, to containment?
That seems to me the exact right question. That we are tempted always to think, what's going to make this way? Sorry, the question, if you didn't hear it, was, what's the best of bad solutions, right? And, you know, I'm often by this kind of problem put in mind of a kind of paraphrase of Immanuel Kant's question that he opens the Critique of Pure Reason with, and he says, there's some questions that we can neither avoid nor answer. And that's, in a way, what these problems are. All of the people working on it knew that the idea of marking this waste for 10 millennia was outsized to our capabilities. And yet the idea of not marking it, I mean, for instance, around the WIP site is the biggest load of untapped petrochemicals in the world right now. And thus, you can see the borders of the WIP site by where they're digging. So the oil men are furiously interested in getting there, and they've gotten permission to dig slantwise under one of the corners. I mean, they're just chomping at the bit. So the idea of not marking it is really a bad idea. And it seems like a moral infraction, a known moral hazard to not do that. But then probably the best, my view, is actually burying the waste, is recognizing that this is no panacea, is still better than having it on the surface. So I do think that in terms of least bad, now what we're actually doing, 80% of American waste and 90% of the world power waste are in those pools. That, to my mind, is manifestly the worst of the worst. Because we've seen what happens. You lose outside power. What happened at Fukushima was there was an earthquake and the power lines went down. And then the tsunami came in and flooded and knocked off the additional fuel supplies. They put the alternate generators underground to protect them from earthquakes. But now they've just drowned like rats under the tsunami. So now they had no way of producing more power, getting power from the outside. They had no extra fuel on site, and they had no pumps because they were now drowned. So they were without power. The water stopped, the water heated, it boiled, and the rods got exposed. It was a miracle that they were able to keep it from burning. And the only reason that happened was that there had been these explosions of hydrogen which blew the roof off those buildings, and they were able to get water in with fire trucks and helicopters. So getting the old fuel that's cool enough after 3 to 5 years out of those is the first and most urgent thing we should do. Second, we probably should bury them in a geologically sound and not just politically expedient way. And then when they're underground, how to mark them, probably we need to throw the book at it. That is to say, and this is, they reckon, the people who were designing these monuments knew that. Bury small samples, bury ceramic tablets, have markers on the surface, have radar reflectors under, shallow underground so you could see where it was if you were an airplane or spacecraft. Do all the things that you could do and hope that one of them would work. That's kind of the Acropolis message, that if you want to communicate with the future, put it in as many modes as possible. But is it a guarantee? Not a chance.
Thank you so much for this, tying together so many different threads into one fascinating and infuriatingly difficult project. I'm looking at this picture and many of the others that you showed that the futurists came up with, or architects designed as possible ways to mark the site. And I'm feeling just like that figure in the picture did, and like I did when I was at Stonehenge, for example, which is I want to go climb in there. And I'm guessing that anytime something of this magnitude and that is this unusual is erected in the landscape, people get curious and want to explore it. So it seems like the very novelty of any of these markers would actually attract more attention than it repelled. And I wonder, is there any example of a warning that people in future generations obeyed? And related to that, what do you think could be an effective stay away?
So that's a really good question. Some of the people who are working on this, like Mike Brill, an architect, a landscape architect, thought about it was he and his team who designed this. They were very aware that people would be attracted to the monuments. And so one of the things that they wanted to do was not to signal the special or sacred at some kind of center point. So they tried to design things that wouldn't suggest, that wouldn't draw you towards a particular spot. That was one thing. They also knew they should use rude and crude materials. Because at Stonehenge, we know there were more stones at Stonehenge than are there now. You can see the compressed land with ground-penetrating radar. So people still, why? Because granite's really good to build with. And those stones were hauled, they were hauled there and they were hauled away. And so they're now probably in some buildings or fragments of buildings from sometime in the last 6,000 years. So they were worried about that. So they tried to think about different combinations of materials that would be durable against weathering, wind, and decay, desiccation, and so on, but not useful for somebody to haul off. So about warning signs, if you go by on the Savannah River, which separates South Carolina from Georgia in this area, you see warning signs, don't fish, and they're rusting and falling in the water and falling down. And so, we're not very good at warning people, even right now. So in South Carolina, for instance, they warn people pretty well not to fish. Now, there are a lot of communities there that fish anyway, but at least they get these warnings. In Georgia, 50 feet away, on the other side of the river, it's not a very wide river, they don't. So, we're not good at this. And I think, as I mentioned to the previous question, probably our best shot is to have multiple layers of warning. And then I think the kinds of things, in terms of in the particular case of monuments, I think Mike Brill and his team had to me, one of the more interesting ideas. Now, there were ideas about making pictures, for instance, cartoons. One of the things they had in cartoon sequences, they had a sort of, somebody coming up to a can, opening it, and on the ground, and then people said, but what if people read it the other way? Some cultures read right to left, some people read left to right, and if you did that, it looked like the miracle cure. You're not feeling well, you get up, you take some of this stuff, and then you're good as new. So then they thought, well, maybe we could make it up to down, and because nobody reads down to up, although lots of cultures read right to left instead of left to right. So those are the kind of challenges that they had. There was one artist who was a member of the team, the guy who actually did a lot of the drawings for the Voyager spacecraft, and he was very anti-art. He thought art, and he thought these were too artistic. So he said, don't go for art. Keep the drawings very crude and rough. Don't make it into a shrine. Just communicate, that's all. And so, and of course they started out in the most naive way with skulls and crossbones. Here they are on the Mexican border. That's not a good idea because skeletons don't signify the same on one side as the other. So it took a long time of struggling to imagine what sorts of things to do. And they had to have a design to open the plant, but they keep changing the design. The current design, they don't have to finalize it until the plant has been abandoned or is about to be abandoned, because as long as they're the walk-in huts with machine guns, you don't need it. And so the current design, if you can imagine a kind of pseudo-Stonehenge, imagine you have dominoes, and you made a rectangle with the dominoes like that in the rectangle. That's sort of what it looks like. No top part, as in Stonehenge. And then there's some kind of structure in the center, and there are berms, and there are warnings and so on. There are plaques that warn. So that's what they have to have that on file to continue to operate the plant. Now you might say, oh, this is American craziness. The Europeans would never do anything so crazy as this. There is a European project. They do worry about this. They're very different in different countries. I'll give you one example, the French. Because the French have 80% of their electricity is from nuclear plants. We have about 20% in the United States. The French, think that the American idea of trying to communicate from now to the far future is crazy, and that you should, a little bit like the nuclear priesthood, hand it off to the next generation. And they base this on an idea of democracy, that we should have an intergenerational democracy, that is to say each generation should be able to retrieve the waste and redo its disposition in some other way. Well, it turns out, like most things in the French-American axis, they're not as far apart as both sides like to make them, that in fact the American plant, what's really going to happen is the waste is going to be consolidated but above ground, and for another 100 to 200 years kept in these, what's called these hard casks. And the French, although they say they're burying it just for another generation, they're only good for a couple of 100 years before the walls begin to collapse and you begin to lose control over them. So it's not really as different as it seems, but the French trust future generations, and they don't trust science or the rocks. And the Americans don't trust future generations to take care of this stuff, and they do trust the science and the rocks. Now, it's an interesting contrast because the French, the French are now in the Fifth Republic, so count them. They've had 9 governments, 9 forms of government since the Revolution, and they've been invaded multiple times by their neighbor. And so that, the idea of political stability they trust. The Americans have had, well, modulo the last year, political stability for a couple of 100 years and don't trust the future of political stability at all. So it's an interest, it's a kind of a giant scale Rorschach test for a culture about what they believe in and what they fear.
Thank you. I appreciate you being here. This is fascinating. I worked at both Rocky Flats and have walked through the Nevada test site where more than 900 explosions took place. And I was thunderstruck that I could do that. I thought those lands would be off limits forever. The big craters, the Sedan crater, all those places where those tests took place. So it makes me think that that's a different exposure problem than the one you're talking about storage. But I also am the son of a physicist who worked in weapons labs, and what they designed and came up with over the decades makes me think that people like you will also come up with an answer that renders some of this stuff not so poisonous. What's your outlook for that in the future?
Well, just a few comments, and then I'll answer your question directly. One is that, as you know, the Nevada test site is now a tourist destination, and they open it up, once every 6 weeks or so to tours, and people can go to visit the Sedan crater, for instance, take pictures and go out there. Time-limited visits, but it is open for this kind of touristic encounter. I think that if you have a tiny amount of material, you can change its chemistry and its nuclear structure. The problem is the amount of waste that we have is immense. These tanks at Hanford have 1 million gallons each of sludge in it, a mix of nuclear materials, but also solvents and all sorts of different chemicals in it. The Savannah River site has about 50 of these. So there are about 220 million gallons of this stuff. And all the nuclear powers have something similar, because what you do to make plutonium, and you know this very well, but maybe others don't, is you have a nuclear power plant, essentially a reactor. You take the rods out, you dunk them into a bath of acid, dissolve it, and then you take out the plutonium that's been produced. And so then there's all the other stuff that's still very radioactive and very toxic that's in that mix, this acidic bath of all these different things. So the question has been what to do with that. And for 50 to 70 years, we haven't done anything with them. They're sitting in these tanks. Now, one of the things that they are doing at Savannah River site and at Hanford is, I think, a good thing. add to the least bad list. And that is, they're taking the liquids, they evaporate the parts that can be safely evaporated. They take the remaining parts and extract the highly radioactive materials that they can chemically, the uranium and the plutonium especially. And then those are concentrated and mixed with sand and heated to make glass. So they make these big glass rods that are about 10 feet high and about that far around. And these are highly radioactive. You came up to them, it would kill you. But those were supposed to go to Yucca Mountain, and they need to be buried eventually somewhere. But because they're in glass, they're actually not leaking. So the radioactive material is actually locked in. Now, you can't change all that radioactivity into not radioactivity, but you can keep it localized. And even if you took a hammer and bashed this, I mean, assuming you had a faraway hammer and you bashed it, the pieces still won't leak because it's not a glass bottle of something inside it. The glass itself is chemically mixed with the radioactive materials. So this seems to me a good idea. Then you've got the remaining stuff, which is much less radioactive, and they mix that with concrete and make these giant sort of barn-sized blocks of concrete. That's, you know, that program is one that I think is worth supporting. And one of the things that's being debated right now in Congress is whether there will be money to continue the remediation program for Savannah River and Hanford, Washington. So those are things I don't, you know, then people say, well, could you launch it into the sun? Well, the problem is rockets explode on the way up, and that would be a catastrophe. Could you bury them in the sea? Well, international law of the sea forbids that, and the British were doing that for a long time until it was exposed and became a big international issue. They would just dump this stuff into the North Sea. The French dump waste into the English Channel through pipes, and they say that's not dumping at sea because it never went on a ship. It just went out an outfall pipe. The British do the same thing towards Ireland. So, you know, it's a rotten history. We can do better. And some of the things we could do better would be the glass logs, burying, getting stuff out of pools. These are all solutions that seem to me to move in the right. They're less bad by far than what we're doing now, which is to keep these things in the tanks for the weapons waste or in the pools for the civilian waste.
It seems as though you've sketched out a problem for humanity. And it also seems that our scientific capabilities have far, far outpaced the public's ability to understand the results. In order to carry out some of the programs that you just talked about, you have to have politicians who will allocate the funds, approve the programs, and they can be executed. Looking at this issue very, very broadly, and we could be talking about genetics or we could be talking about tonight's topic, but where do you see, let's take the American public, in terms of its understanding of science as it has developed since, let's say, 1940?
Well, I mean, one of the things that's happened in the large-scale political structure of the United States, but also culturally, is that we've had a major change in a political realignment in the attitude towards science. During the Cold War, it was the Republicans, not the Democrats, that supported centralized, high-end university research. Democrats weren't against it, but they had other concerns like distributing more democratically to more sites and so on. In recent years, as you know, climate change issues, environmental issues, ecological science, have been so disparaged that the scientists feel very much under siege by Republican stated and acted upon policy. So in addition to the long-term problem of how to make science a part of our educational system and to encourage and do it well, we have a political overlay that makes that very difficult. So that's one aspect of this that needs to, but it's my sincere hope that this is a passing matter, and that issues like environmental concern, toxicity, climate change will become more of a consensus politics the way it has in all the other countries in the world. But there's another part of this which seems to me very important, which is many of the issues that we face today are both scientific and not scientific, like this one. I mean, there's a science question here. How do you localize radioactive material in glass? I mean, there are specific issues. But there are other issues like, where do we put this? Who gets to decide? Does northern New Mexico, does Mexico, does Nevada, does Arizona, do the counties and states that have the trucks passing through them get a vote? Who gets to decide? I mean, there's a very good initiative in Europe that that said that was trying to discourage rich European countries from dumping their radioactive waste in Africa, for example. So they said, no, you can't cross national lines with nuclear waste. You have to deal with it. Okay, that's probably a good idea. Then the Netherlands says, you know what? Our country, Nether, the low countries, we're below sea level. Do you really want us burying our nuclear waste from our nuclear power below sea level? That doesn't seem like a very good strategy. And the other European countries said, yeah, you're probably right, but if we make an exception for you, the whole deal is going to fall apart. We're not making an exception. You're responsible for your nuclear waste. So the problem of handling the geopolitics of where you locate something, who gets to decide? Does this generation get to decide for generations, for 10,000, 100,000, a million years? Even if we vote, even if we decided we have a great system and we're going to vote for a 1,000-mile radius around nuclear plants, it's just us. What about our children 15 generations removed? So there's there are notions both of economic, environmental justice questions in a geographical sense, but also an intergenerational equity question. So these questions of who decides are very central. And more broadly in science, I think you see that with bioprivacy. If you get a DNA test, your brother now has much of his DNA, lodged with Ancestry or the FBI or the DIA or whoever wants to calibrate, or the country that steals the data from that base. What about computer privacy? And those are technical questions, but they're not technical questions. And I think that makes the question of science education and bringing people into it, to me, a question that's central to democracy, not in the sense that was popular to say in 1960 or 70, which is an educated people make good democratic citizens. I mean the fundamental questions that we're going to face have both a non-scientific and a scientific component. So even making these decisions about bioprivacy or nuclear waste or environmental regulation, these biological markers and so on, these are questions that go really to the core of how we understand an individual, the relationship to the state, familial responsibilities, intergenerational equity, current, equity questions across zones, race, across race and economic zones. Many of these plants are in very poor areas that are historically. Savannah Riverside is, in order to build that 300 square mile site, they tore down an African American town and moved it, destroyed it, and moved those that wanted to go to a new site somewhere else. So, these questions keep coming back. And Native Americans, there were 1,000 uranium mines on Navajo territory during the Cold War. 1,000. And essentially all of them are now shut down. But they're dangerous. And there's a lot of nuclear materials, dust and so on, that make some areas of the Navajo Nation highly dangerous to cattle, dangerous to people. So these questions I think that science education is no longer just a nice-to-have thing. I think they're really central to democratic deliberation.